Hello, everyone. Let's see if this is working today. Hello, and happy Monday, April the 6th. This is Pastor Trena Turner getting ready to go live and pick up our This Present Darkness reading. Let's see. Today we are going to, last week we read our first 4 chapters of This Present Darkness. And now we're going to pick up and read our next 4 chapters. So I am excited about that. Checking out the live stream. Are you on, Rufus? Go on and see if it's coming across, please. Can you? Right now, please. Yeah. And let's just see what we got going on here, because it's coming up a little bit different for me on this end.
You're right here.
Can you hear me?
No, that's not you. That's from last week.
Right.
Oh, it's live now, but it's showing. Oh, that's you.
Oh, there's Alicia. Maybe it is coming on.
Yeah.
All right. Hey, Alicia, you ready for it? Are you comfortable again this go round? Getting ready to do our reading?
Oh, there's Alicia.
Yay. All right, you can turn the sound down now. Hello, everyone. We're going to be reading This Present Darkness, our next 4 chapters tonight, and I'm excited about it. I've got my water and ready to go on. So just welcome. I'm glad to have all of you all joining us today. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Hello, my sister. I see you. Hey, Sister Wilnika. Yay. All right. So let's see. Why don't you all type in the chat line? What character did you remember from last time? Any character stood out in your mind? Type it down in the comment. Let's see. Anybody remember? Yes. Hi, Sister Dolores. I miss you. What other characters do you all remember from last week? You guys trying to think about it, huh? Mm-hmm. I'm checking out this Brummel. Yep, Brummel stood out. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, we had the pastor, and we had a couple of those imps and what have you. Well, let's go ahead and get started so I can take a full, we're at 5:02, and I want to make sure that I honor you all's time for joining early. Oh, the Father. Yeah, Aretha. Exactly. Let's go ahead. And so for those that are just joining us, I'm Pastor Trena Turner with the Victory and Praise Church, and we are doing a community reading for adults. And so our reading that we've picked up was very aggressive. It's This Present Darkness by Frank Peretti, and it's a book that I love. We are 4 chapters in. We will be starting tonight with chapter 5, and we'll be reading chapters 5 through 8. Is that 5, 6, 7, and 8? Yep, that's 4 chapters. We'll be reading chapters 5 through 8 on tonight. So I hope you're comfortable. We're going to go ahead and get started. Chapter 5 of This Present Darkness. A short distance across the campus. Let me start again. Oh, my word. A short distance across the campus, but enough distance to be safe. 2 giant men descended to earth like glimmering bluish-white comets, held aloft by rushing wings that swirled in a blur and burned like lightning. One of them, a huge, burly, black-bearded bull of a man, was quite angry and indignant, bellowing and making fierce gestures with a long, gleaming sword. The other was a little smaller and kept looking about with great caution, trying to get his associate to calm down. In a graceful, fiery spiral, they drifted down behind one of the college dormitories and came to rest in the cover of some overhanging willows. The moment their feet touched down, the light from their clothes and bodies began to fade, and the shimmering wings gently subsided. Save for their towering stature, they appeared as 2 ordinary men, one trim and blond, the other built like a tank, both dressed in what looked like matching tan fatigues. Golden belts had become like dark leather. Their scabbards were dull copper, and their glowing bronze bindings on their feet had become simple leather sandals. The big fellow was ready for a discussion. Triscoe, he growled, but at his friend's desperate gestures, he spoke just a little softer. What are you doing here? Triscoe kept his hands up to keep his friend quiet. Shh, Kilio. The spirit brought me here, the same as you. I arrived yesterday. You know what? You know what that was? A demon of complacency and despair if I ever saw one. If your arm hadn't held me, I could have struck him, and only once. Oh, yes, Giulio, only once, his friend agreed. But it's a good thing I saw you and stopped you in time. You've just arrived and you don't understand. What don't I understand? Triscoe tried to say it in a convincing manner. We must not fight. Not yet, Giulio. We must not resist. Giulio was sure his friend was mistaken. He took a firm hold of Triscoe's shoulder and looked him right in the eye. Why should I go anywhere but to fight? He stated. Here I was called, here I will fight. Yes, Triscoe, nodding furiously. Just not yet, that's all. Then you must have orders. You do have orders. Triscoe paused for effect and then said, Tal's orders. Giulio's angry expression at once melted into a mixture of shock and perplexity. Dusk was settling over Ashton, and the little white church on Morgan Hill was washed with the warm, rusty glow of the evening sun. Outside in the small churchyard, the church's young pastor hurriedly mowed the lawn, hoping to be finished before mealtime. Dogs were barking in the neighborhood. People were arriving back at home from work. Kids were being called in for supper. Unseen by these mortals, Giulio and Triscoe came hurriedly up the hill on foot, secretive and unglorified, but moving like the wind nevertheless. As they arrived in front of the church, Hank Bush came around the corner behind the roaring lawnmower, and Giulio had to pause to look him over. Is he the one? Triscoe. Did the call begin with him? Yes, Triscoe answered. Months ago. He's praying even now, and often walks the streets of Ashton interceding for it. But this place is so small. Why was I called? No, why was Tal called? Triscoe only pulled at his arm. Hurry inside. They passed quickly through the walls of the church and into the humble little sanctuary. Inside they found a contingent of warriors already gathered, some sitting in the pews, others standing around the platform, still others acting as sentries, looking cautiously out the stained glass windows. They were all dressed much as Triscoe and Giulio, in the same tan tunics and breeches, but Giulio was immediately impressed by the imposing stature of them all. These were the mighty warriors, the powerful warriors, and more than he had ever seen gathered in one place. He was also struck by the mood of the gathering. This moment could have been a joyful reunion of old friends, except that everyone was strangely somber. As he looked around the room, he recognized many whom he had fought alongside in times far past. Nathan, the towering Arabian, who fought fiercely and spoke little. It was he who had taken demons by their ankles and used them as war clubs against their fellows. Armuth, the big African, whose war cry and fierce countenance had often been enough to send the enemy fleeing before he even assailed them. Giulio and Armuth had once battled the demon lords of the villages in Brazil and personally guarded a family of missionaries on their many long treks through the jungles. Shimon, the meek European with the golden hair, who bore on his forearm the marks of a fading demon's last blows before Shimon banished him forever into the abyss. Giulio had never met this one, but had heard of his exploits and his ability to take blows simply as a shield for others, and then to rally himself to defeat untold numbers alone. Then came the greeting of the oldest and most cherished friend. Welcome, Giulio, the strength of many. Yes, it was indeed Tal, the captain of the host. It was so strange to see this mighty warrior standing in this humble little place. Gilo had seen him near the throne room of heaven itself in conference with none other than Michael. But here stood the same impressive figure with golden hair and ruddy complexion, intense golden eyes like fire, and an unchallengeable air of authority. Gilo had approached his captain, and the two of them clasped hands. "And we are together again," said Gilo, as 1,000 memories flooded his mind. No warrior Gilo had ever seen could fight as Tal could. No demon could outmaneuver or outspeed him. No sword could parry a blow from the sword of Tal. Side by side, Gilo and his captain had vanquished demonic powers for as long as those rebels had existed, and had been companions in the Lord's service before there had been any rebellion at all. "Greetings, my dear captain," Tal said by way of explanation. "It's a serious business that brings us together again." Gilo searched Tal's face. Yes, there was plenty of confidence there, no timidity, but there was definitely a strange grimness in the eyes and the mouth, and Gilo looked around the room once again. Now he could feel it. That typically silent and ominous prelude to the breaking of grim news. Yes, they all knew something he didn't. Sorry, guys, that's my mom calling me while I'm reading. Hi, Mom.
Hi, I was trying to get the reading program.
Okay, go on Facebook onto my Facebook page.
Okay, just press this thing on the side.
Right where it says Facebook. All of Facebook watching me talk to you right now because I'm in the middle of reading.
Oh, well, go ahead.
So go into Facebook, the blue button, okay? All righty. Bye-bye. Let's see, Mama. Where was I at? Here we go. Pardon our interruption. Let's see. Now he could feel it, that typically silent and ominous prelude to the breaking of grim news. Yes, they all knew something he didn't, but were waiting for the appointed person, most likely Tal, to speak it. Gilo couldn't stand the silence, much less the suspense. 23, he counted, of the very best, most gallant, the most undefeatable, gathered now as though under siege, cowering in a flimsy fortress from the dreaded enemy. With a dramatic flair, he drew his huge sword and cradled the blade in his free hand. "Captain Tal, who is this enemy?" Tal answered slowly and clearly. "Rafar, the prince of Babylon." All eyes were now on Gilo's face, and his reaction was much like that of every other warrior upon hearing the news. Shock, disbelief, an awkward pause to see if anyone would laugh and verify that it was only a mistake. There was no such reprieve from the truth. Everyone in the room continued to look at Gilo with the same deadly serious expression, driving the gravity of the situation home mercilessly. Gilo looked down at his sword. Was it now shaking in his hands? He made a point of holding it still, but he couldn't help staring for a moment at the blade, still gashed and discolored from the last time Gilo and Tal had confronted this Baal prince from the ancient times. Gilo and Tal had struggled against him 23 days before finally defeating him on the eve of Babylon's fall. Gilo could still remember the darkness, the shrieking and horror, the fierce, terrible grappling while pain seared every inch of his being. The evil of this would-be pagan god seemed to envelop him, and everything around him like thick smoke, and half the time the two warriors had to maneuver and strike blindly, each one not knowing if the other was still in the fight. To this day, neither of them even knew which one finally delivered the blow that sent Rafar plummeting into the abyss. All they remembered was his heaven-shaking scream as he fell through a jagged rift in space, and then seeing each other again when the great darkness that surrounded them cleared like a melting fog. "I know you speak the truth," Gilo said at last, "but would such as Rafar come to this place? He is a prince of nations, not mere hamlets. What is this place? What interest could he possibly have in it?" Tal only shook his head. "We don't know, but it is Rafar. There's no question. And the stirrings in the enemy's realm indicate something is in the making. The Spirit wants us here. We must confront whatever it is. And we are not to fight. We are not to resist, Gillo exclaimed. I will be most fascinated to hear your next order, Tal. We cannot fight? Not yet. We're too few, and there's very little prayer cover. There are to be no skirmishes, no confrontations. We're not to show ourselves in any way as aggressors. As long as we stay out of their way, keep close to this place, and pose no threat to them, our presence here will seem like normal watch care over a few struggling saints. Then he added with a very direct tone, and it will be best if it not be spread that I am here. Gillo now felt a little out of place, still holding his sword, and sheathed it with an air of disgust. And he prodded, you do have a plan. We were not called here to watch the town fall. The lawnmower roared by the windows, and Tal guided their attention to its operator. It was Chimon's task to bring him here, he said, to blind the eyes of his enemies and slip him in through, ahead of the adversary's choice for the pastor of this flock. Chimon succeeded. Hank was voted in, to the surprise of many, and now he's here in Ashton, praying every hour of the day. Every hour of every day. We were called here for his sake, for the saints of God and for the Lamb. For the saints and God and for the Lamb, they all echoed. Tal looked at the tall, dark-haired warrior, the one who had taken him through the town the night of the festival, and smiled. And you had him win by just one vote. The warrior shrugged. The Lord wanted him here. Chimon and I had to make sure he won, and not the other man who has no fear of God. Tal introduced Gilio to this warrior. Gilio, this is Cryone, watch carer of our prayer warrior here and of the town of Ashton. Our call began with Hank, but Hank's presence here began with Cryone. Gilio and Cryone nodded silent greeting to each other. Tal watched Hank finishing up the lawn and praying out loud at the same time. So now, as his enemies in the congregation regroup and try to find another way to oust him, he continues to pray for Ashton. He's one of the last, if not the last, lamented Cryone. No, cautioned Tal. He's not alone. There's still a remnant of saints somewhere in this town. There's always a remnant. There's always a remnant, they all echo. Our conflict begins in this place. We'll make this our location for now. Hedge it in and work from here. He spoke to a tall Oriental in the back of the room. Signa, take as your charge this building, and choose two now to stand with you. This is our rest point. Make it secure. No demons is to approach it. Signa immediately found two volunteers to work with him. They vanished to their posts. Now, Triskel, I'll hear news of Marshal Hogan. I followed him up to my encounter with Gilio, though Cryone had reported a rather eventless situation up to the time of the festival. Ever since then, Hogan has been hounded by a demon of complacency and despair. Tal received that news with great interest. Could be he's beginning to stir. They're covering him, trying to hold him in check. Cryone added, I never thought I'd see it happen. The Lord wanted him in charge of the Clarion, and we took care of that too. But I've never seen a more tired individual. Tired, yes, but that will only make him more usable in the Lord's hands. And I perceive that he is indeed waking up, just as the Lord foreknew. Though he could awaken only to be destroyed, said Triskel. They must be watching him. They fear what he can do in his influential position. True, replied Tal. So while they bait our bear, we must be sure they stir him up, and no more than that. It's going to be a very critical business. Now Tal was ready to move. He addressed the whole group. I expect Rafar to take power here by nightfall. No doubt we'll all feel it when he does. Be sure of this. He will immediately search out the greatest threat to him and try to remove it. Ah, Henry Bush, said Gilio. Cryone and Triskel, you can be sure that a troop of some kind will be sent to test Hank's spirit. Select for yourself 4 warriors and watch over him. Tal touched Cryone's shoulder and added, Cryone, up until now, you've done very well in protecting Hank from any direct onslaughts. I commend you. Thank you, Captain. I ask you now to do a difficult thing. Tonight, you must stand by and keep watch. Do not let Hank's life be touched. But aside from that, prevent nothing. It will be a test he must undergo. There was a slight moment of surprise and wonderment, but each warrior was ready to trust Tal's judgment. Tal continued. As for Marshal Hogan, he's the only one I'm not sure about yet. Rafar will give his lackeys incredible license with him, and he could either collapse and retreat or, as we all hope for, rouse himself and fight back. He'll be of special interest to Rafar and to me tonight. Gillo, select 2 warriors for yourself and 2 for me. We'll watch care over Marshall tonight and see how he responds. The rest of you will search out the remnant. Tal drew his sword and held it high. The others did the same, and a forest of shining blades appeared, held aloft in strong arms. Rafar, Tal said in a low, musing voice, we meet again. Then, in the voice of a captain of the host, for the saints of God and for the Lamb. For the saints and God and for the Lamb, they echoed. Complacency unfurled his wings and drifted into Stewart Hall, sinking down through the main floor and into the catacombs of the basement level, the area set aside for administration and the private offices of the psychology department. In this dismal netherworld, the ceiling was low and oppressive, and crawling with water pipes and heat ducts that seemed like so many huge snakes waiting to drop. Everything, walls, ceiling, pipes, woodwork, was painted the same dirty beige, and light was scarce, which suited Complacency and his associates just fine. They preferred the darkness, and Complacency noticed that there seemed to be a touch more than usual. The others must have arrived. He floated down a long burrow of a hallway to a large door at the end marked conference room and passed through the door into a cauldron of living evil. The room was dark, but the darkness seemed more of a presence than of a physical condition. It was a force, an atmosphere that drifted and crept about the room. Out of that darkness glared many pairs of dull, yellow cat eyes, belonging to a horrible gallery of grotesque faces. The various shapes of Complacency's fellow workers were outlined and backlit by a sourceless red glow. Yellow vapors slithered in lacy wisps about the room and filled the air with its stench as the many apparitions carried on their hushed, gargling conversations there in the dark. Complacency could sense their common disdain for him, but the feeling was mutual enough. These belligerent egotists would walk on anyone to exalt themselves, and Complacency just happened to be the smallest, hence the easiest to persecute. He approached 2 hulking forms in the middle of some debate, and from their massive spine-covered arms and poisonous words, he could tell they were demons who specialized in hate, planting, aggravating, and spreading it, using their crushing arms and venomous quills to constrict and poison the love out of anyone. Complacency asked them, "Where's Prince Lucius?" "Find him yourself, lizard," one of them growled. A demon of lust, a slithery creature with darting and shifting eyes and a slippery hide, overheard and joined in, snatching Complacency with his long, sharp talons. "And where have you been sleeping today?" it asked with a sneer. "I do not sleep," Complacency retorted. "I cause people to sleep. To lust and steal innocence is far better. But someone must turn away the eyes of others." Lust thought that over and gave a smirk of approval. He dropped Complacency rudely, as those who watched laughed. Complacency passed Deception, but didn't bother to ask him anything. Deception was the proudest, haughtiest demon of them all, very arrogant in his supposedly superior knowledge of how to control men's minds. His appearance was not even as gruesome as the other demons. He almost looked human. His weapon, he boasted, was always a compelling, persuasive argument with lies ever so subtly woven in. Many others were there. Murder, his talons still dripping with blood. Lawlessness, his knuckles honed into a spike like protrusion and his hide thick and leathery. Jealousy, as suspicious and difficult a demon to work with as any. But complacency finally found Lucius, the Prince of Ashton, the demon who held the highest position of all of them. Lucius was in conference with a tight huddle of other power holders, going over the next strategies for controlling the town. He was unquestionably the demon in charge. Huge to begin with, he always maintained an imposing posture with his wings wrapped loosely around him to widen his outline. His arms flexed, his fists clenched and ready for blows. Many demons coveted his rank, and he knew it. He had fought and banished many to get where he was, and he had every intention of staying there. He trusted no one and suspected everyone, and his black, gnarled face and hawk-sharp eyes always carried the message that even his associates were his enemies. Complacency was desperate and enraged enough to violate Lucius's idea of respect and decorum. He shoved his way through the group and right up to Lucius, who glared at him, surprised by the rude interruption. "My prince," Complacency pleaded, "I must have a word with you." Lucius' eyes narrowed. Who was this little lizard to interrupt him in the middle of a conference, to violate decorum in front of these others? "Why aren't you with Hogan?" he growled. "I must speak with you." "Dare you speak to me without my first speaking to you?" "It is vitally important. You're making a mistake. You're bothering Hogan's daughter," and Lucius immediately became a small volcano, spewing forth horrible cursings and wrath. "You accuse your prince of a mistake? You dare to question my actions?" Complacency cowered, expecting a stinging blow any moment, but he spoke anyway. "Hogan will do us no harm if you let him alone, but you have only to light a fire within him, and he cast me off." The blow came. Whop! A walloping swat from the back of Lucius' hands, and as Complacency tumbled across the room, he debated whether or not to speak another word. When he came to rest and regathered himself, he looked up to see every eye upon him, and he could feel their mocking disdain. Lucius walked slowly toward him and towered over him like a giant tree. "Hogan casts you off? Is it not you who releases him? Do not strike me, only hear my appeal." Lucius' big fist clenched painfully around handfuls of Complacency's flesh and snatched him up so they were eye to eye. "He could stand in our way, and I won't have that. You know your duty, perform it." Well, I was, Complacency cried. "He was nothing to fear at all, a slug, a lump of clay. I could have held him there forever. So do it. Prince Lucius, please hear me. Give him no enemy. Let him have no need to fight." Lucius dropped him on the floor in a humiliated heap. The prince addressed the others in the room. "We have given Hogan an enemy." They all knew how to answer. "No, indeed." "Deception," Lucius called, and Deception stepped forward, giving Lucius a formal bow. "Complacency accuses his prince of bothering Hogan's daughter. You would know about that." "You have ordered no attack on Sandy Hogan, Prince," Deception answered. Complacency pointed his taloned finger and screamed, "You have followed her. You and your lackeys. You have spoken words to her mind, confused her." Deception only raised his eyebrows in mild indignation and answered sedately, "Only upon her own invitation. We have only told her what she prefers to know. That can hardly be called an attack." Lucius seemed to take on some of Deception's maddening haughtiness as he said, "Sandy Hogan is one case, but certainly her father is quite another. She poses no threat to us. He does. Shall we send someone else to hold him in check?" Complacency had no answer, but added another note of concern. I saw messengers of the living God today." That only brought laughter from the group. Lucius sneered. "Are you becoming that timid, Complacency? We see messengers of the living God every day." "But they were close, about to attack. They knew my actions, I'm sure. You look all right to me, though if I were one of them, I would surely pick you as easy prey. More laughter from the group spurred Lucius on, a limp and easy target for mere sport. A lame demon with a weak angel can prove his strength. Complacency cowered in shame. Lucius strode about addressing the group. Do we fear the host of heaven? He asked. As you do not, we do not, they all answered with great polish. As the demons remained in their basement lair, patting each other's backs and stabbing complacencies, they took no notice of the strange, unnatural cold front outside. It moved slowly over the town, bringing a harsh wind and chilling rain. Though the evening had promised to be bright and clear, it now grew dark under a low, oppressive shroud, half natural, half spirit. Atop the little white church, Cigna and his two companions continued to stand guard as the darkness descended over Ashton deeper and colder with each passing moment. All over the nearby neighborhood, dogs began to bark and howl. Here and there, a quarrel broke out among humans. He's here, Cigna said. In the meantime, Lucius's preoccupation with his own glory kept him from noticing the little attention he was getting now from his troops. All the other demons in the room, large or small, were gripped by a steadily rising fear and agitation. They could all feel something horrible coming closer and closer. They began to fidget, their eyes darting about, their faces twisting with apprehension. Lucius gave Complacency a kick in the side as he walked by and continued his boasting. Complacency, you can be sure that we have things very much in control here. No worker from our number has ever had to sneak about for fear of attack. We roam this town freely, doing our work unhampered, and we will succeed in every place until the town is fully ours. You listless, limp little bungler, to fear is to fail. Then it happened, and so very suddenly that none of them could react with anything other than air-piercing shrieks of terror. Lucius had hardly gotten the word fail out of his mouth before a violent, boiling cloud crashed and thundered into the room like a tidal wave, a sudden avalanche of force that crushed like iron. The demons were swept across the room like so much debris in a raging tide, tumbling, screaming, wrapping their wings tightly around themselves in terror, all except for Lucius. As the demons recovered from the initial shock wave of this new presence, they looked up and saw Lucius's bloody, contorted like a broken toy, in the grip of a huge black hand. He struggled and choked and gagged and cried for mercy, but the hand only tightened its crushing grip, inflicting punishment without mercy, descending down out of the darkness like a cyclone from a thundercloud. Then the full figure of a spirit appeared, carrying Lucius by the throat and shaking him about like a rag doll. The thing was bigger than anything they had ever seen before, a giant demon with lion-like face, fiery eyes, incredibly muscular body, and leathery wings that filled the room. The voice gargled up from the deep within the demon's torso and sprayed out in clouds of fiery red vapor. You who have no fear, are you afraid now? The spirit angrily hurled Lucius across the room to join the others, then stood like a mountain in the center of the room, wielding a deadly S-curved sword the size of a door. His bared fangs glistened like the jeweled chains around his neck and across his chest. Obviously, this prince of princes had been greatly honored for his past victories. His jet black hair hung like a mane to his shoulders, and on each wrist he wore a gold bracelet studded with sparkling stones. His fingers displayed several rings, and a ruby red belt and a scabbard adorned his waist. The expansive black wings draped down behind him now like the robe of a monarch. For an eternity, he stood there, glaring at them with sinister, smoldering eyes, studying them. And all they could do was remain motionless in their terror, like a macabre tableau of frightened goblins. Finally, the big voice echoed off the walls. Lucius, I feel I was not expected. You will announce me. On your feet. The sword moved across the room, and the tip snagged Lucius in the height of his neck, jolting him to his feet. Lucius knew he was being belittled in the sight of his underlings, but he made every effort to hide his rising bitterness and anger. His fear showed well enough to adequately cover his other feelings. Fellow workers, he said, his voice quivering despite every effort. Baal Rephar, the prince of Babylon. Automatically, they all leapt to their feet, partly out of fear for respect, mostly out of fear of the tip of Rephar's sword, still waving slowly back and forth, ready to move against any dawdlers. Rephar gave them all a quick looking over. Then he inflicted another personal blow against Lucius. Lucius, you will stand with the others. I have come and only one prince is needed. Friction. Everyone could feel it immediately. Lucius refused to move. His body was stiff, his fists clenched as tightly as ever. And though he was visibly trembling, he purposely returned the glaring look of Rephar and stood his ground. You have not asked me to yield my place, he challenged. The others were not about to intervene or even get close. They backed off. Remembering that Rephar's sword could probably sweep a very wide radius, the sword did move, but so quickly that the very thing anyone perceived was a scream of pain from Lucius as he coiled into a twisted knot on the floor. Lucius's sword and scabbard lay on the floor, skillfully cut away by one swift slash from Rephar. Again, the sword moved, and this time the flat of the blade clamped Lucius to the floor by his hair. Rephar leaned over him, blood-red breath spewing from his mouth and nostrils as he spoke. I perceive you wish to challenge for my position. Lucius said nothing. Answer! No, Lucius cried. I yield. Up. Get up. Lucius struggled to his feet, and Rephar's strong arm stood him with the others. By now, Lucius was a most pitiful sight, totally humiliated. Rephar reached down with his sword and with the barbed tip picked up Lucius's sword and scabbard. The sword swung like a huge crane and deposited Lucius's weapon in the deposed demon's hands. Listen well, all of you, Rephar addressed them. Lucius, who fears not the host of heaven, has shown fear. He is a liar and a worm and is not to be heeded. I say to you, fear the host of heaven. They are your enemies, and they are intent on defeating you. As they are ignored, as they are given place, so they shall overcome you. Rephar walked with heavy, ponderous steps up and down the line of demons, giving them all a closer look. When he came to complacency, he drew close. Complacency fell backwards. Rephar caught him around the back of the neck with one finger and pulled him straight. Tell me, little lizard, what did you see today? Complacency was suffering from a sudden memory lapse. Rephar prodded him. Messengers of the living God, you said? Complacency nodded. Where? Just outside this building. What were they doing? Did they attack you? No. Was there a flash of light? That seemed to register with complacency. He nodded. When a messenger of God attacks, there is always light, Rephar addressed all of them angrily, and you let it slip by. You laughed. You mocked. A near attack from the enemy, and you ignored it. Now Rephar returned to grill Lucius some more. Tell me, deposed prince, how stands the town of Ashton? Is it ready? Lucius was quick to say, yes, Baal Rephar. Oh, then you have taken care of this praying Bush and this sleeping troublemaker Hogan? Lucius was silent. You have not. First, you allow them to come into places we reserved for our own special appointments. It was a mistake, Baal Rephar, Lucius blurted. The Clarion editor was eliminated according to our orders, but no one knows where this Hogan came from. He bought the paper before anything could be done. And Bush? It was my understanding that he fled from your attacks. That was another man of God, the first one. He did flee. And this younger man sprung up in his place from nowhere. A long, foul sigh hissed out through Rephar's fangs. The host of heaven, he said. While you have taken them for granted, they have moved in the Lord's chosen right under your noses. It is no secret that Henry Bush is a man who prays. Do you fear that? Lucius nodded. Yes, of course, more than anything. We've been attacking him, trying to drive him out. And how has he responded? He, speak up. He prays. Rafar shook his head. Yes, yes, he is a man of God. And what about Hogan? What have you done about him? We we have attacked his daughter. Complacency's ears perked up at that. His daughter? But Complacency couldn't contain himself. I told him it wouldn't work. I told them it wouldn't work. It would only make Hogan more aggressive and wake him from his lethargy. Lucius grabbed for Rafar's attention. If my lord would allow me to explain. Explain! Rafar instructed Lucius while warily eyeing Complacency. Lucius quickly formulated a plan in his mind. Sometimes a direct attack is not so wise. So we found a weakness in his daughter and we felt we could divert his energies toward her, perhaps destroy him at home and disintegrate his family. It seemed to work on the former editor. It was at least a start. It will fail, cried Complacency. He was harmless until they tampered with his sense of well-being and comfort. Now I fear I won't be able to hold him back. He is a quick, threatening gesture from Rafar's outstretched hand stifled Complacency's wailings. I do not want Hogan held back, Rafar said. I want him destroyed. Yes, take his daughter. Take anything else that can be corrupted. A risk is best removed, not tolerated. But Rafar quickly took hold of him and spoke with noxious fumings right into his face. Discourage him. Surely you can do that. Well, but Rafar was in no mood to wait for an answer. With a powerful spin of his wrist, he hurled Complacency out of the room and back to work. We will destroy him, assault him on every side until he has no solid ground left from which to fight. As for this new man of God who has sprung up, I'm sure an adequate trap can be laid. But concerning our enemies, how strong are they? Not strong at all, answered Lucius, trying to recover his competency rating. But cunning enough to make you think they are weak? A fatal mistake, Lucius. He addressed all of them. You are to no longer take orders. Are no longer take the enemy for granted. Watch him. Count his numbers. Know his whereabouts, his skill, his name. No mission was ever undertaken that was not challenged by the host of heaven. And this mission is nothing small. Our Lord has very important plans for this town. He has sent me to fulfill them, and that is enough to draw the very hordes of the enemy down upon our heads. Be fearful of that and give place nowhere. And as for these two thorns in our hoof, these two implanted barriers, tonight we will see what they're made of. Amen. That was chapter 5. We're moving on to chapter 6, This Present Darkness. It was a dark, rainy night, and the raindrops pelting against the old single-pane windows made sleep difficult for Hank and Mary. She dropped off eventually, but Hank, already troubled in spirit, found it much harder to relax. It had been a lousy day anyway. He had worked on painting that slogan off the front of the house and tried to figure out who in the world would write such a thing against him. His ears were still ringing with the conversation he'd had with Alf Brummel, and his mind was still playing over and over the bitter comments from the board meeting. Now he could add to his apprehensions the congregational meeting on Friday, and he prayed to the Lord in desperate, hushed whispers as he lay there in the dark. Funny how every lump in the mattress seems so much more lumpy when you're upset. Hank began to worry that he would keep Mary awake with all his tossing and turning. He lay on his back, his side, his other side. He put his arms under the pillow. He put his arms over the pillow. He grabbed Kleenex, blew his nose. He looked over at the clock, 12:20. They had turned in at 10. But sleep finally does come, usually in such an unannounced way that you don't even know you're out until you wake up. Sometime that night, Hank dozed off. But after a few hours, his dreams began to go sour. They were the usual silly thing at first, like driving a car through his living room and then flying in the car as if it turned into an airplane. But then the images began to rush and riot through his head, growing frantic and chaotic. He started running from dangers. He could hear screams. There was the sensation of falling and the sight and taste of blood. Images went from bright and colorful to monochromatic and dismal. He was constantly fighting, struggling for his life. Innumerable dangers and enemies surrounded him, closing in. None of it made any sense. But one thing was very definite throughout: stark terror. He wanted desperately to scream, but didn't have time between fighting off enemies, monsters, unseen forces. His pulse began to pound in his ears. The whole world was reeling and throbbing. The horrible conflict rushing in his head began to push its way to the surface of the conscious, everyday Hank. He stirred in the bed, rolled over on his back, drew a deep waking up breath. His eyes half opened, not focused on anything. He was in that strange state of stupor halfway between sleep and consciousness. Did he really see it? It was an eerie projection in midair, a glowing painting on black velvet, right above the bed, so close he could smell sulfurous breath. A hideous mask of a face hovered, contorted in grotesque movements as it spit out vicious words he couldn't understand. Hank's eyes opened like a sprung trap. He thought he could still see the face just fading away, but instantly he felt like he'd been struck by a very heavy blow to his chest. His heart began to race and pound like it would burst through his ribs. He could feel his pajamas and the bed sheets sticking to him, drenched in sweat. He lay there panting for breath, waiting for his heart to calm down, for the stark terror to go away, but nothing changed, and he couldn't make it change. You're just having a nightmare, he kept telling himself, but he couldn't seem to wake up. He purposely opened his eyes wide and looked around the darkened room, even though part of him wanted to regress back to childhood and just hide under the covers until the ghosts and the monsters and burglars went away. He saw nothing in the room out of the ordinary. A goblin in the corner was nothing but his shirt hanging on a chair, and the strange halo of light on the wall was only the street light reflecting off the crystal of his watch. But he had been severely frightened, and he was still scared. He could feel himself shaking as he desperately tried to sort hallucination from reality. He watched, listened. Even the silence seemed sinister. He found no comfort in it, only the dread that something evil hid behind it, an intruder or demon waiting, watching for the right moment. What was that? A creak in the house? Of footsteps? No, he told himself. Just the wind against the windows. The rain had stopped. Another noise. This time a rustling in the living room. He had never heard that noise at night before. Gotta wake up. Gotta wake up. Come on, heart. Quiet down so I can hear. He forced himself to sit up in bed, even though it made him feel more vulnerable, and he remained there for several minutes, trying to stifle his heart's pounding with his hand over his chest. The pounding finally settled back a little, but the rate remained rapid. Hank could feel the sweat turning cold against his skin. To get up or go back to sleep? Sleep was definitely out. He decided to get up, look around, walk it off. A clatter this time in the kitchen. Now Hank started praying. Marshall had had the same kind of dreams and felt the same heart-pounding fear. Voices. It sure sounded like voices somewhere. Sandy? Maybe a radio. But who knows, he thought to himself. This town is going crazy anyway, and now the sickies are in my house. He slid stealthily out of bed and put on his slippers and moved over to the closet to procure a baseball bat. Just like back at home, he thought. Now somebody's going to have mush for brains. He looked out of his bedroom window, up and down the hallway. No lights were on anywhere. No flashlight beams played about. But his guts were doing a square dance under his ribs, and there had to be some reason for it. He reached for the hallway light and flipped the switch. Nuts, the bulb was burned out. Since when, he didn't know, but he stood in the dark and felt his courage deflated just that much more. He gripped the bat more tightly and moved down the hall, staying close to the wall, looking ahead, looking behind, listening. He thought he could hear a quiet rustling somewhere, something moving. At the archway that led into the living room, his eyes caught something, and he pressed himself against the wall for concealment. The front door was open. Now his heart really started pounding, thudding rudely in his ears. In a strange jungle way, he felt better. At least there was an indication of a real enemy. It was this lousy fear without any reason that was spooking him. He had already been through that sort of thing once today. With that thought came a strange idea. That professor lady must be in the house. He moved down to the hall to check Sandy's room and make sure she was all right. He wanted to stay between Kate and Sandy and whatever was out there in the rest of the house. Sandy's bedroom door was open, and that was unusual. It made him all the more cautious. He inched along the wall toward the doorway, and then, bat ready in his hands, he peered into the room. Something was up. Sandy was, at least. Her bed was empty, and she was gone. He flicked on the bedroom light. The bed had been slept in, but now the covers were thrown back hastily, and the room was in disarray. As Marshall moved cautiously down the darkened hallway, it did occur to him that Sandy might just be up getting a drink, using the bathroom, reading. But such simple logic weakened against that horrible feeling that something was dreadfully wrong. He took deep breaths, trying with his greatest effort to hold himself steady, while all the time he felt an insidious, unearthly terror, as if he were inches from the crushing teeth of some monster he couldn't see. The bathroom was cold and dark. He turned on the light, dreading what he thought he might see. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. He left that light on and headed back towards the living room. He peered like some kind of stalking fugitive through the archway. There was that rustling sound again. He flipped on the lights. The cold night air was coming in through the front door, rustling the drapes. No, Sandy was nowhere to be seen, not in the living room, not anywhere in or near the kitchen. Perhaps she was right outside. But he had an undeniable qualm about crossing the living room to the front door, walking past all the furniture that could hide an assailant. He gripped the bat tightly, keeping it up and ready. He kept his back to the wall as he made his way around the perimeter of the room, stepping around the sofa after checking behind it, hurriedly maneuvering around the stereo and finally reaching the door. He went out onto the porch into the cool night air and for some reason suddenly felt safer. The town was still quiet this time of night. Everyone else was certainly asleep right now, not sneaking around their houses with baseball bats. He took a moment to regather himself and then went back inside. Locking the door behind him was just like shutting himself in a dark closet with a couple of hundred vipers. The fear returned and he tightened his grip on the bat. With his back against the door, he looked around the living room. Why was it so dark? The lights were on, but every bulb seemed so dim, as if there were some kind of brownout. Hogan, he said to himself, either you've really lost a screw or you're in big, big trouble. He remained frozen there by the door, motionless, looking and listening. There had to be somebody or something in the house. He couldn't hear them or see them, but he could certainly feel them. Outside the house, lying low in the evergreens and hedges, Tal and his company watched as the demons, at least 40, according to Tal's count, played havoc with Marshall's mind and spirit. They swooped like deadly black swallows in and out of the house, through the rooms, around and around Marshall, screaming taunts and blasphemies, and playing with and ever increasing his fears. Tal kept careful watch for the dreaded Rafar, but the Baal wasn't coming among this wild group. There could be no doubt, however, that Rafar had sent them. Tal and the others agonized, feeling Marshall's pain. One demon, an ugly little imp with bristling, needle-sharp quills all over his body, leaped upon Marshall's shoulders and beat upon his head, screaming, "You're going to die! You're going to die, Hogan! Your daughter is dead, and you're going to die!" Gilio could hardly control himself. His big sword slipped with metallic ring from its sheath, but Tal's strong arm held him back. "Please, Captain," Gilio pleaded. "Never before have I only watched this happen." "Bridle yourself, dear warrior," Tal cautioned. "I will strike them only once." Gilio could see that even Tal was severely pained by his own order. Forbear, forbear. He must go through it.
Yeah.
Hank had the lights on in the house, but he thought his eyes must have been playing tricks on him because the room still looked dark. The shadows deep. Sometimes he couldn't tell if it was himself moving on the shadows in the room, a strange undulating motion in the light. Shadows made the depth in the house shift back and forth like the slow, steady motion of breathing. Hank stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the living room, watching and listening. He thought he could feel a wind moving through the house, but not a cold one from outside. It was like a hot, sticky breath laden with repulsive odors, close and oppressive. He had discovered that the clatter in the kitchen was due to a spatula sliding off the drain board and onto the floor. That should have calmed his nerves right down, but he still felt terrified. He knew he would sooner or later have to move into the living room to have a look. He took his first step out of the doorway and into the room. It was like falling into a bottomless well of blackness and terror. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled as if with static electricity. His lips started spilling out a frantic prayer. He went down before he even knew what was happening. His body pitched forward and slammed into the floor. He became a trapped animal, instinctively struggling, trying to get loose from the unseen, crushing weight that held him. His arms and legs were smacking into furniture and knocking things over, but in his terror and shock, he felt no pain. He squirmed, twisted, gasped for breath, and lashed out at whatever it was, feeling resistance against the motion of his arms like stroking through water. The room seemed filled with smoke, blackness like blindness, a loss of hearing, a loss of contact with the real world, time standing still. He could feel himself dying. An image, a hallucination, a vision, or a real sight broke through for an instant. Two ghastly yellow eyes full of hate. His throat began to compress, squeezing shut. Jesus! He heard his mind cry out, help me! His next thought, a tiny instant flash, must have come from the Lord. Rebuke it. You have the authority. Hank spoke the words, though he couldn't hear the sound of them. I rebuke you in the name of Jesus. The crushing weight upon him lifted so quickly, Hank felt he would sail upward from the floor. His lungs filled with air and noticed he was now struggling against nothing. But the terror was still there. The blackness, the black sinister presence. He sat up halfway, drew another breath and spoke it clearly and loudly. In the name of Jesus, I command you to get out of this house. Mary awoke with a jerk, startled and then terrified by the sound of a multitude screaming in anguish and pain. The cries were deafening at first, but they faded as if moving off into the unseen distance. Hank! She screamed. Marshall roared like a savage and raised the bat high to strike down his attacker. The attacker screamed also out of stark terror. It was Kate. They had unknowingly backed into each other in the dark hallway. Marshall, she exclaimed, and her voice quivered. She was close to tears and angry at the same time. What on earth are you doing out here? Kate, Marshall sighed, feeling himself shrink like a punctured inner tube. What are you trying to do? Get yourself killed? What's wrong? She was looking at the baseball bat and knew something was up. She clung to him in fear. Is there someone in the house? No, he muttered in a combination of relief and disgust. Nobody. I looked. What happened? Who was it? Nobody, I said. But I thought you were talking to someone. He looked at her with the utmost impatience and said with a steadily building volume, do I look like I've been having a friendly chat with someone? Kate shook her head. Well, I must have been dreaming, but it was the voices that woke me up. What voices? Marshall, it sounded like a New Year's Eve party in there. Come on, who was it? Nobody. There was nobody in here. I looked. Kate was very flustered. I know I was awake. You heard ghosts. He could feel her hand squeezing the blood out of his arm. Don't talk like that. Sandy's gone. What do you mean gone? Gone where? She's gone. Her room's empty. She's not in the house. She's poof, gone. Kate hurried down the hall and looked in Sandy's room. Marshall followed her and observed from the doorway as Kate checked the room over. Looking through the closet and some of the drawers, she reported with alarm. Some of her clothes are gone. Her school books are missing. She looked at him helplessly. Marshall, she's left home. He looked back at her for a long moment, then around the room, then rested his head against the door jamb with a quiet thud. Nuts, he said. I knew she wasn't herself tonight. I should have found out what was wrong. We didn't hit it off too well today. Well, that was obvious. You came home without her. How'd she get home anyway? Her girlfriend, Terry, brought her. Well, maybe she went over to Terry's for the night. Should we call to find out? I don't know. You don't know? Marshall closed his eyes and tried to think. No, it's late. Either she's there or she isn't. If she isn't, we'll be getting them out of bed for nothing. And if she is, well, she's okay anyway. Kate seemed a little panicked. I'm going to call. Marshall held up his hand and leaned his head against the door jamb. Again, as he said, hey, don't get all spooked now, all right? Give me a minute. I just want to see if she's there. All right. But Kay could see something was very wrong with Marshall. He was pale, weak, shaken. What's the matter, Marshall? Give me a minute. She put her arm around him, concerned. What is it? He had quite a struggle getting it out. I'm scared. Trembling a bit, his eyes closed, his head resting against the door jamb, he said it again. I'm really scared, and I don't know why. That scared Kate. Marshall, don't get upset, will you? Just keep it level. Can I do anything? Just be tough, that's all. Kate thought for a moment. Well, why don't you get your robe on and I'll warm you some milk, okay? Yeah, great. It was the first time any demons had ever been actually confronted and rebuked by Hank Bush. They had certainly come with an arrogant brashness at first, descending on the house in the dead of night to raid and ravage, screaming and swooping through the rooms and leaping on Hank and terrifying him. But as Cryone and Triskel and the others watched from their hiding place, confused and scattered flocks of demons suddenly came thundering and fluttering out of the house like bats, screaming, indignant, stopping their ears. There must have been close to 100, all the usual demon pranksters and troublemakers Cryone had seen at work all over town. No doubt the great Baal had sent them, and now they had been routed. There was no telling what Rafar's reaction or his next plan would be. But Hank had proven himself very well. In a moment the coast was clear, the trouble was over, and the warriors came out of hiding. Breathing easier, Cryone and Triskel were impressed. Cryone commented, Tal was right. He's not so insignificant. Triskel agreed. Stern stuff, this Henry Bush. But as Henry and Mary sat trembling at their kitchen table, she preparing an ice pack as he sporting a welt on his forehead and a great many bruises and scrapings. On his arms and his shins, neither one of them felt entirely stern, powerful, or victorious. Hank was thankful to have escaped with his life, and Mary was still in a mild state of shock and disbelief. It was awkward with neither of them wanting to relate his or her experience first, for fear that the whole thing was nothing but an excess of pickles and pastrami before bedtime. But Hank's welts kept growing, and he could only tell what he knew. Mary bought every word of it, scared as she was by the screams that had awakened her. As they shared their not-so-pleasant experiences, they were able to accept the fact that the whole night of madness had been very frighteningly real and not some nightmare. Demons, Hank concluded. Mary could only nod. But why? Hank pleaded to know. What was it for? Mary wasn't ready to come up with any answers. She kept waiting for Hank to do that. He muttered, like lesson number 1 in front lines of combat. I wasn't a bit ready for it. I think I flunked. Mary gave him the ice pack and he placed it against the welt, wincing at the pressure. What makes you think you flunked? She asked. I don't know. I just walked into it, I guess. I let them clobber me. Then he prayed, Lord God, help me to be ready next time. Give me the wisdom, the sensitivity to know what they're up to. Mary squeezed his hand, said amen, and then commented, You know, I might be wrong, but hasn't the Lord already done that? I mean, how are you going to know how to fight Satan's direct attacks unless you just do it? That's what Hank needed to hear. Wow, he mused. I'm a veteran. And I don't think you flunked either. They're gone, aren't they? And you're still here. And you should have heard those screams. Are you sure it wasn't me? Quite sure. Then came a long, troubled silence. So what now? Mary finally asked. Let's pray, said Hank. For him, that option was always an easy jump to. And pray they did, clasping hands at the little kitchen table, having a conference with the Lord. They thanked him for the experience of that night, for protecting them from danger, for showing them a very close glimpse of their enemy. Over an hour passed, and during that time, the field of concern continued to grow outward. Their own problems began to take a small place in a vastly wider perspective as Hank and Mary prayed for their church, for the people in it, for the town and the people that ran it, the state, the nation, the world. Through it all came the beautiful assurance that they had indeed connected with the throne of God and had conducted serious business with the Lord. Hank grew more determined to stay in the battle and give Satan a real run for his money. He was sure that was what God wanted. The warm milk and Kate's company had a soothing effect on Marshall's nerves. With each swallow and each additional minute of normalcy, he gained more and more assurance that the world would still go on. He would live and the sun would rise in the morning. He was amazed at how bleak things had looked just a little while ago. Feeling better? Kate asked, buttering some fresh toast. Yeah, he answered, noticing that his heart had retreated back into his chest and returned to normal everyday pace. Boy, I don't know what got into me. Kate placed the 2 slices of toast on a plate and set them on a table. Marshall crunched off a bite of toast and asked, So she's not at Terry's? Kate shook her head. Do you want to talk about Sandy? Marshall was ready. We probably need to talk about a lot of things. I don't know how to start. You think it's my fault. Oh, Marshall. Come on, be honest. I've been getting my behind whipped all day. I'll listen. Her eyes met his and remained in place, denoting a sincerity and firm love. Categorically, no, she said. I botched it today. I think we've all botched it, and that includes Sandy. She's made some choices too, remember? Yeah, but maybe it was because we didn't have anything better to give her. What do you think of talking to Pastor Young? Case in point. Huh? Hogan shook his head despondently. Maybe. Maybe Young's just a little too cush, you know? He's into all this family of man stuff, discovering yourself, saving the whales. Kate was a little surprised. I thought you liked Pastor Young. Well, I guess I do, but sometimes, no, a lot of the time, I don't even feel like I'm going to church. I might as well be sitting at a lodge meeting or in one of Sandy's weird classes. He checked her eyes. They were still steady. She was listening. Kate, don't you ever get the feeling that God's got to be, a little bigger, tougher? The God we get at that church, I feel like he isn't even a real person. And if he is, he's dumber than we are. I can't expect Sandy to buy that stuff. I don't even go for it myself. I never knew you felt this way, Marshall. Well, maybe I didn't either. It's just that this thing tonight, I've really got to think about it. There's been so much of it going on lately. What do you mean? What's been going on? I can't tell her, Marshall thought to himself. How could he explain the strange hypnotic persuasion he was sure he got from Brummel, the spooky feelings he's gotten from Sandy's professor, the stark terror he felt that night? None of it made sense. And now to top it off, Sandy was gone. All through these situations, he had been horrified by his own inability to fight back. He had felt controlled, but he couldn't tell Kate anything like that. Oh, it's a long story, he said finally. All I know is this whole thing, our lifestyle, our schedule, our family, our religion, whatever it is, just isn't working. Something has to change. But you don't think you want to talk to Pastor Young? Oh, he's a turkey. Just then, 1 a.m. or not, the phone rang. Sandy, Kate exclaimed. Marshall snatched up the receiver. Hello? Hello, said a female voice. You're up? Marshall recognized the voice with disappointment. It was Bernice. Oh, hi, Bernie, he said, looking at Kate, whose face sank now with frustration. Don't hang up. I'm sorry for calling at this late hour, but I had a date and I didn't get home until late. But I wanted to develop the film. Are you mad? I'll be mad tomorrow. Right now, I'm too tired. What have you got? Get this. I know the film and the camera had 12 pictures of the carnival, including the ones of Brummel, Young, and those 3 unknowns. Today I went home and shot the rest of the roll, 12 more frames, my cat, the neighbor lady with the big mole, the evening news, etc. Today's pictures came out. There was a pause, and Marshall knew he would have to ask, what about the other ones? The emulsion was blacked out, totally exposed. The film scratched and fingerprinted in a few places. There's nothing wrong with the camera, Marshall said. Nothing for a long moment. Marshall? Hello? That's interesting, he said. They're up to something. It got me all excited. I'm wondering if I can trace those prints. There was another long pause. Hello? What did the other woman look like? The blonde one. Not too old, long blonde hair, kind of mean looking. Heavy, thin, in between. She looked good. Marshall's forehead crinkled a bit and his eyes shifted about as he followed his ideas. I'll see you in the morning. Goodbye, and thanks for answering. Marshall hung up the phone and he stared at the tabletop, drumming his fingers. What was that all about? Kate asked. He said, still thinking. Then he answered, newspaper stuff, no biggie. Well, what was it we were talking about anyway? Well, if it still matters, we were just talking about whether or not you should talk to Pastor Young about our problem. Young, he said, and almost sounded angry. But if you don't want to, Marshall stared at the table while his warm milk got cold. Kate waited, then roused him with, would you rather talk about this in the morning? I'll talk to him, Marshall said flatly. I want to talk to him. You bet I'll talk to him. It couldn't hurt. No, it sure couldn't. I don't know when he'd be able to see you, but 1 o'clock would be nice. He scowled a bit. 1 o'clock would be perfect. Marshall, Kate started, but she kept it back. There was something happening to her husband, and she picked it up in his voice, in his expression. She had never really missed that fire in his eyes. Perhaps she'd never known it was gone until this moment when, for the first time since they left New York, she saw it again. Some old, unpleasant feelings rose up within her, feelings that she had no desire to cope with late at night with her daughter mysteriously missing. Marshall, she said, sliding out of her chair and picking up the plate of half-eaten toast, let's get some sleep. I may not be able to sleep. I know, she said quietly. All this time, Tal, Gilio, Nathan, and Arma had stood in the room carefully observing, and now Gilio began to chuckle in his gruff, quaking way. Tal said with a smile, no, Marshall Hogan, you never were much of a sleeper, and now Rafar has helped you to awaken again. Woo-hoo! 2 down. How are you all doing? You good? Just wanted to stop and get a quick drink of water. All right, I see you, cousin. I'm so glad you all are on. L'Oreal, Mother Margie. We're going to move on. We are now reading In This Present Darkness, chapter number 7. Here we go. On Tuesday morning, the sun was shining through the windows and Mary was busy beating the daylights out of some bread dough. Hank found the name and number in the church records, the Reverend James Farrell. He had never met Farrell, and all he knew was the tasteless and malicious gossip going around about the man who had been his predecessor and had since moved far away from Ashton. It was a whim, stab in the dark. Hank knew that, but he sat down on the couch, picked up the phone, and dialed the number. Hello? A tired older man's voice answered. Hello, said Hank, trying to sound pleasant despite his tight nerves. James Farrell? Yes. Who is this? This is Hank Bush, the pastor of the... He heard Farrell give a drawn-out, knowledgeable sigh. Ashton Community Church. I guess you must know who I am. Yes, Pastor Bush. So, how are you? How do I answer that, Hank wondered. Okay in some respects, and not okay in other respects, Farrell offered, completing Hank's thoughts. Boy, you've really been keeping up on things. Well, not actively. I do hear from some of the members from time to time. Then he added quickly, I'm glad you called. What can I do for you? Talk to me, I guess, Farrell answered. I'm sure there's a lot of things I could say to you. I do hear there's a congregational meeting this Friday. Is that true? Yes, it is. A vote of confidence, I understand. That's right. Yeah, I went through the same thing, you know. Brummel, Turner, Mayer, and Stanley were in charge of that one, too. You gotta be kidding. Oh, it's strictly history repeating itself, Hank. Take it from me. They drummed you out? They decided they didn't like what I was preaching and the direction of my ministry. So they stirred up the congregation against me and then managed to take it to a vote. I didn't lose by much, but I did lose. The same 4 guys? The same 4. But now, did I hear right? Did you really put Lou Stanley out of fellowship? Well, yeah. Now that is something. I can't imagine Lou letting anyone do that to him. Well, the other 3 made that a pivotal issue. They haven't left me alone about it. And how is the congregation leaning? I don't know. They could be pretty evenly divided. So how are you standing up under all of this? Hank could think of no better way to phrase it, he said. I think I'm under attack. Direct spiritual attack. Silence at the other end. Hello? Oh, I'm here, Farrell talked slowly, falteringly as if thinking hard while trying to converse. What kind of spiritual attack? Hank stammered a bit. He could imagine how last night's experience would sound to a stranger. Well, I just think Satan is really involved here. Farrell was almost demanding. Hank, what kind of spiritual attack? Hank began his account carefully, trying very hard to sound like a sane and responsible individual as he related the major points, the mania Brummel seemed to have for getting rid of him, the church division, the gossip, the angry church board, and the slogan painted on his house, and then the spiritual wrestling match he had gone through last night. Farrell interrupted only to ask clarifying questions. I know it all sounds crazy, Hank concluded. All Farrell could do was to let out a deep sigh. And he muttered, oh, blast it all. Well, like you say, it's just history repeating itself. No doubt you've encountered things like this, right? Or am I the one who has the real problem here? Farrell struggled with the words. I am glad you called. I always struggled with whether or not I should call you. I don't know if you're going to like hearing this, but Farrell paused for new strength and then said, Hank, are you sure you belong there? Uh-oh. Hank felt a defensiveness rising in him. I do believe firmly in my heart that God called me here, yes. Do you know you were chosen as pastor by accident? Well, some are saying that, but it is true, Hank. You really should consider that. You see, the church ousted me, and they had some other minister all picked out and ready to move in. Some guy who had a wide and liberal enough religious philosophy to suit them. Hank, I really don't know how you ended up with the job, but it was definitely some kind of organizational fluke. The one thing they did not want in there was another fundamentalist minister, not after they went to such great lengths to get rid of the one they had. But they voted me in. It was an accident. Brummel and the others were definitely not planning on it. Well, that's obvious now. Okay, good. You can see that. So let me just get right down to some direct advice. Now, after Friday, this all may be mute anyway. But if I were you, I'd get packing and start looking for a position elsewhere, no matter how the vote comes out. Hank deflated a little. This conversation was turning sour. He just couldn't buy it. All he could do was sigh into the phone. Farrell was forceful. Hank, I've been there. I've been through it. I know what you're going through, and I know what you have yet to go through. Believe me, it isn't worth it. Let them have that church. Let them have the whole town. Just don't sacrifice yourself. But I can't leave. Yeah, right. You have a calling from God. Hank, so did I. I was ready to go into battle, to make a real stand in that town for God. You know, it cost me my home, my reputation, my health. It almost cost me my marriage. I left Ashton literally planning on changing my name. You have no idea of who you're dealing with. There are forces at work in that town. What kind of forces? Well, political, social, spiritual too, of course. Oh yeah, you never did answer my question. What about what happened to me last night? What do you think about that? Farrell hesitated and then he said, Hank, I don't know why, but it's very difficult for me to talk about such things. All I can say to you is get out of that place while you can. Just drop it. The church doesn't want you there. The town doesn't want you there. I can't leave. I told you that. Farrell paused for a long time. Hank was almost afraid he had hung up, but then he said, all right, Hank, I'll tell you, and you listen. What you went through last night, well, I think I may have had similar experiences, but I can assure you, whatever it was only the beginning. Pastor Farrell, I'm not a pastor. Call me Jim. That's what the gospel is all about. Fighting Satan, shining the light of gospel into darkness. Hank, all the nice homilies you can dig up won't help you there. Now, I don't know how equipped or ready you are, but to be perfectly honest, if you come through it all with even your life, I'll be surprised. I'm serious. Hank had no answer he could give. Jim, I'll let you know how it turns out. Maybe I'll win, maybe I won't come out alive, but God didn't tell me I'd come out alive. He just told me to stay and fight. You've made one thing clear to me. Satan does want this town, and I can't let him have it. Hank replaced the receiver and felt he would cry. Lord God, he prayed. Lord God, what shall I do? The Lord gave no immediate answer, and Hank sat there on the couch for several minutes trying to regather his strength and confidence. Mary was still busy in the kitchen. That was good. He couldn't talk to her right now. There were too many thoughts and feelings to be sorted out. Then a verse came to his mind. Arise, walk through the land in the length of it and in the breadth of it, for I will give it unto thee. Well, it sure beats sitting home just fussing and fuming and not really doing anything. So on went his sneakers, and out the door he went. Crowley and Triscoll were outside waiting for their charge. Invisibly, they joined Hank, one on each side, and walked him down Morgan Hill toward the center of town. Hank was not a man of great stature anyway, but between these two giants he looked even smaller. He did, however, appear very, very safe. Triscoll kept a wary eye open, saying, "What's he up to anyway?" Crowley knew Hank pretty well by now. I don't think he even knows. But the Spirit is driving him. He's giving action to a burden in his heart. Oh, we'll have action, all right. Just don't be a threat. So far, it's the best way to survive in this town. So tell that to the little pastor here. As Hank neared the main business district, he paused on a corner to look up and down the street, watching old cars, new cars, vans and 4x4s, shoppers, walkers, joggers, and bicyclers stream in 4 and more directions, regarding the orders of the traffic light as mere suggestions. So where was this evil? How could it be so vivid last night and a distant, dubious memory today? Demons, no demons or devils lurked in the office windows or reached out of storm drains. The people were the same, simple, ordinary folk he'd always seen, still ignoring him and passing by. Yeah, this was the town he prayed for night and day, with deep groanings of the heart because of a burden he couldn't explain, and now it was taxing his patience and unsettling him. Well, are you in trouble or aren't you? Or don't you even care? He said aloud. Nobody listened. No deep, sinister voices answered back with a threat. But the Spirit of the Lord inside him wouldn't leave him alone. Pray, Hank. Pray for these people. Don't let them escape your heart. The pain is there. The fear is there. The danger is there. So when do we win? Hank answered the Lord. Do you know how long I've been sweating and praying over this place? Just once I'd like to hear a little pebble make a splash. I'd like to see this dead dog twitch when I poke it. It was amazing how well the demons could hide, even behind the doubts he sometimes felt about their very existence. I know you're out there, he said quietly, gazing carefully over the blankly staring faces of the buildings, the concrete, the brick, the glass, and the trash. The spirits were teasing him. They could descend on him in a moment, terrorize and choke him, and then vanish, slipping back into the hiding places behind the facade of the town, snickering and hiding and seeking, watching him grope about like a blind fool. He sat down on the sidewalk bench, feeling miffed. I'm here, Satan, he said. I can't see you, and maybe you can move faster than I can, but I'm still here. And by the grace of God and the power of the Holy Spirit, I intend to be a thorn in your side until one of us has had enough. Hank looked across the street at the impressive structure of the Ashton United Christian Church. Hank had known some terrific Christians who belonged to that denomination, but this particular bunch in Ashton were different, liberal, even bizarre. He had met Pastor Oliver Young a few times and could never get very close to him. Young seemed rather cold and aloof, and Hank could never figure out why. As Hank sat there, watching a brown Buick pull into the church parking lot, Triscoll and Cryoni stood beside the bench, also watching the car come to a stop. Only the two of them could see the car's special passengers. Sitting on the roof were 2 big warriors, the Arabian and the African, Nathan and Armith. No swords were visible. They were taking a passive, non-combatant posture, according to Tal's orders, just like all the rest. Marshall had seen Bernice's film. He had seen the minute scratches from some kind of mishandling. He had seen the clumsy fingerprints at regular intervals that could very well have been placed there by a hand pulling the film out of the camera, unrolling it in the light. Marshall had gotten his appointment with Young for 1 o'clock. He pulled into the vast blacktop parking lot at 12:45, still downing a deluxe cheeseburger and a large coffee. Ashton United Christian was one of the large, stately-looking edifices around town, constructed in the traditional style with heavy stone, stained glass, towering lines, majestic steeple. The front door fit the motif. Large, solid, even a little intimidating, especially when you tried to heave it open all by yourself. The church was located near the center of town, and the carillon in the tower chimed each hour and gave a short concert of hymns at noon. It was a respected establishment. Young was a respected minister, and the people who attended the church were respected members of the community. Marshall had often thought that respect and status just might be a prerequisite for membership. He engaged the big front door in a short Indian arm wrestle and finally got inside. No, this congregation had never spared the expense, that was for sure. The floors of the foyer, stairs, and sanctuary were covered with thick red carpeting. The woodwork was all deep finished oak and walnut. On top of that was all the brass. Brass door handles, coat hooks, stairway railing, and window latches. The windows, of course, were stained glass, and all the ceilings were lofty and with great hanging chandeliers and delicate scroll work. Marshall entered the sanctuary through another ponderous door and walked down the long center aisle toward the front. This room was a cross between an opera house and a cavern. The platform was big, the pulpit was big, the chair loft was big, the choir loft was big. Of course, the choir was big too. Pastor Young's big office just to the side of the sanctuary afforded a very visible access to the platform and pulpit. And Pastor Young's entrance through the big oak door each Sunday morning was a traditional part of the ceremonies. Marshall pushed that big door open and stepped into the reception office. The pretty secretary greeted him but didn't know who he was. He told her. She checked the appointment book and verified it. Marshall checked the book too, reading upside down again. The 2 o'clock hour was marked A. Brummel. Well, Marshall, Young said with a cordial businesslike smile and handshake, come in, come in. Marshall followed Young into his plush office. Young, a large-framed man in his 60s with a roundish face and wire-rimmed glasses and thin, well-oiled hair, seemed to enjoy his position both in the church and the community. His dark paneled walls sported many plaques from community and charitable organizations. Along with those were several framed photographs of him posing with the governor, a few popular evangelists, and some authors and a senator. Behind his impressive desk, Young created a perfect picture of the successful professional. The high-backed leather chair became a throne, and his own reflection in the desktop made him all the more scenic and impressive, like a mountain reflected in an alpine lake. He motioned Marshall to a chair, and Marshall sat down, noticing that he sank to eye level, quite below Young's. He began to feel a familiar tinge of intimidation. This whole office seemed designed for it. Nice office, he commented. Thank you very much, said Young with a smile that shoved his cheeks into piles against his ears. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers interlaced and wiggling on the edge of his desk. I enjoy it and thankful for it, and I rather appreciate the warmth, the atmosphere of the place. It sets one at ease. Sets you at ease, thought Marshall. Yeah. So how's the Clarion these days? Oh, pulling itself together. Did you get today's? Yes, it was very good, very neat, stylish. You've brought some of that big city class here with you, I see. Marshall suddenly didn't feel too talkative. I'm glad you're with us, Marshall. We're looking forward to a good relationship. Well, yeah, thanks. So what's on your mind? Marshall fidgeted just a little and then jumped to his feet. That chair made him feel too much like a microbe under a microscope. Next time I'll bring my own big desk, he thought. He walked around the office trying to look casual. We've got a lot to cover in an hour, he began. We can always have more meetings. Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, Sandy, that's my daughter, ran off last night. We haven't heard anything, so we don't know where she is. He gave Young a quick synopsis of the problem and its history, and Young listened intently, no interruption. So, Young finally asked, so you think she's turned her back on your traditional values and that disturbs you? Hey, I'm not a deeply religious person, you know what I mean? But some things have to be right and some things have to be wrong. And I have trouble with Sandy just jumping over the fence from one to the other like she does. Young rose majestically from his desk and walked toward Marshall with the air of another understanding father. He put his hand on Marshall's shoulder and said, do you think she's happy, Marshall? I've never seen her happy, but that's probably because she's around me every time I see her. And that could be because you find it hard to understand the direction she's now choosing for her life. Obviously, you project a definite displeasure toward her philosophies. Yeah, and toward that professor lady who dumps all those philosophies on her. You ever met that, what's her name, Professor Langret? The one at the college? Young thought and shook his head. I think Sandy's taken a couple of courses from her now, and every quarter I find my daughter more out of touch with reality. Young chuckled a bit. Marshall, it sounds like she's just exploring, just trying to find out about the world, about the universe she lives in. Don't you remember growing up? So many things just weren't true until you could prove them yourself. That's probably the way it is right now with Sandy. She's a very bright girl. I'm sure all she needs to explore and just to find herself. Well, whenever she finds out where she is, I hope she calls. Marshall, I'm sure she would feel much more free to call if she could find understanding hearts at home. It's not for us to determine what another person must do with himself or think about his place in the cosmos. Each person must find his own way, his own truth. If we're ever going to get along like any kind of civilized family on this earth, we're going to have to learn to listen and respect each other's man's rights and their rights to their own views. Marshall felt a flash of deja vu, as if a recording from Sandy's brain had been plugged into Young's. He couldn't help but ask, "You sure you never met Professor Langstrop?" "Quite sure," he answered with a smile. "How about Alf Brummel?" "Who?" "Alf Brummel, the police chief." Marshall watched his face. Was he struggling for an answer? Young finally said, "I may have met him on occasion. I was just trying to match the name with the face." "Well, he thinks the way you do too. Talks a lot about getting along and being peaceful. How he got to be a cop, I'll never know." "But weren't we talking about Sandy?" "Yeah, okay. Speak on." Young spoke on. "All the questions you're struggling with, the matters of right and wrong, or what truth is, or different views of these issues. So many of these things are unknowable, save in the heart. We all feel the truth like a common heartbeat in each of us. Every human has the natural capacity for good, for love, for expecting and striving for the best interest of himself and his neighbor." "I guess you weren't here for the festival," Young chuckled. "I'll admit, we humans can certainly misdirect our better inclinations." "Say, did you make the festival, by the way?" "Yeah, some parts of it. Most of it was little interest to me, I'm afraid." "So you didn't drop by the carnival, huh?" "Certainly not. It's a waste of money." "But about Sandy." "Yeah, we were talking about what's true in everyone's view. Like the whole subject of God, for example. She can't seem to find him. I'm just trying to pin him down. We can't agree on our religion, so so far you haven't helped much." Young smiled thoughtfully. Marshall could feel a lofty homily coming. "Your God," said Young, "is where you find him. And to find him, we need only to open our eyes and realize that he is truly within all of us. We've never been without him at all, Marshall. It's just that we've been blinded by our ignorance, and that has kept us from the love, security, and meaning that we all desire. Jesus revealed our problems on the cross, remember? He said, 'Father, forgive them, for they know not.' So his example to us is to search for knowledge wherever we may find it. That's what you are doing, and I'm convinced that's what Sandy is doing. The source of your problem is a narrow perspective, Marshall. You must be open minded. You must search, and Sandy must search." "So," Marshall said thoughtfully, "you're saying it's all a matter of how we look at things." "That would be part of it, yes. And if I might perceive something a certain way, that doesn't mean everybody's going to see it that way, right?" "Yes, that's right." Young seemed pleased with his student. "So let me see if I got this right. If my reporter, Bernice Kruger, perceived that you, Brummel, and three other people were having some kind of little meeting behind the dart throwing booth at the carnival, well, that was just her perception of reality." Young smiled with an odd, "What are you trying to pull?" grin and answered, "I suppose so, Marshall. I guess that would be a case in point. I was nowhere near the carnival, and I told you that. I abhor that kind of event." "You weren't there with Alf Brummel?" "No, not at all." "So you see, Miss Kruger had quite an incorrect perception of someone. Of both of you, I suppose." Young smiled and shrugged. Marshall pressed a little. "What suppose the odds are of that happening?" Young kept smiling, but his face got a little red. "Marshall, what do you wish me to do? Argue with you? Certainly you didn't come here for that sort of thing." Marshall took a real stab at whatever might catch. "She even took some pictures of you." Young sighed and looked for a moment at the floor. Then he said coolly, "Then why don't you bring those photographs next time, and then we can discuss it?" The little smile on Young's face hit Marshall like spittle. "Okay," Marshall muttered, not dropping his eyes. "March will set another appointment for you. Thanks a lot." Marshall checked his watch and went to the door and opened it. Come on in, Alf. Alf Brummel had been sitting in the reception area. At the sight of Marshall, he jumped awkwardly to his feet. He looked the way one might a split second before being hit by a train. Marshall grabbed Alf by the hand and shook his hands excitedly. Hey, buddy. Say, seeing as how the two of you don't seem to know each other very well, let me introduce you. Alf Brummel, this is the Reverend Oliver Young. Reverend Oliver Young, this is Alf Brummel, Chief of Police. Brummel didn't seem to appreciate Marshall's cordiality at all, but Young did. He stepped forward, grabbed Brummel's hand and shook it, and then pulled Brummel quickly into his office, saying over his shoulder, Marge, make another appointment for Mr. Hogan. But Mr. Hogan had left. Thank you, Lord. Last one, last chapter 8. Here we go. Sandy Hogan sat dismally at a small lunch table in a campus plaza shaded by expansive grape arbor. She was staring at a slowly cooling microwave packaged hamburger and a slowly warming half pint of carton of milk. She had made her classes that morning, but they had all slipped by her, mostly unabsorbed. Her mind was too much on herself, her family, and her belligerent father. Besides, it had been a horrible way to spend the night, walking clear across town, sitting all night in the Ashton bus depot, reading from her psychology textbook. After her last class of the day, she tried to take a nap out on the lawn in the sculpture garden and had managed to doze for a short time. When she woke, her world was no better, and she had only two impressions, hunger and loneliness. Now sitting at this little table with a machine-vended lunch, her loneliness was stealing away her hunger, and she was on the brink of tears. Why, Daddy? She whispered in a very soft tone, dabbling her straw in her milk carton. Why can't you just love me for what I am? How could he have so much against her when he hardly even knew her? How could he be so adamant against her thoughts and philosophies when he couldn't even understand them? They were living in two different worlds, and each disdained the others. Last night, she and her father had not said a word to each other the whole evening, and Sandy had gone to bed depressed and angry. Even as she lay there listening to her folks turning out the lights, brushing their teeth, and turning in for the night, they seemed half a world away. She wanted to call them into her room and reach out to them, but she knew it wouldn't work. Daddy would make demands and place conditions on their relationships instead of loving her, just loving her. She still didn't know what terrified her in the pit of the night. All she could remember was waking up plagued by every fear she had ever known, fear of dying, fear of failure, fear of loneliness. She had to get out of the house. She knew even as she hastily dressed and ran out the door that it was foolish and pointless, but the feelings were greater than any common sense she could muster. Now she felt very much like some poor animal shot into space with no means of returning, floating listlessly, waiting for nothing in particular and with nothing to look forward to. Oh, Daddy, she whimpered, and then she began to cry. She let her red hair fall down like soft blinds on either side of her face, and the tears dropped one by one to the tabletop. She could hear people passing by, but they chose to live in their own world and left her alone in hers. She tried to cry softly, which was hard to do when her emotions wanted to rush out of her like the cascade from a broken dam. Came a soft, hesitant voice. Excuse me. Sandy looked up and saw a young man, blond, slightly thin, with big brown eyes full of compassion. The young man said, Please forgive me for intruding, but is there anything I can do to help? It was dark in the living room of Professor Julian Langstrat's apartment and very, very quiet. One candle on the coffee table cast a dull yellow light on the ceiling. High bookcases, the strange oriental masks, the neatly arranged furniture, and the faces of two people who sat opposite each other, the candle between them. One of the people was the professor, her head resting against the back of her chair, her eyes closed, her arms outstretched in front of her, her hands making gentle, sweeping motions as if she were treading water. The man sitting opposite her was Brummel, also with his eyes closed, but not mirroring Langstrat's expressions and actions very well. He looked stiff and uncomfortable. At short intervals and for a split second, he would crack his eyes open just enough to see what Langstrat was doing. Then she began to moan, and her face registered pain and displeasure. She opened her eyes and sat upright. Brummel looked back at her. You don't feel well today, do you? She asked. He shrugged and looked at the floor. I'm okay, just tired. She shook her head, not satisfied with his answer. No, no, it's the energy I feel from you. You're very disturbed. Brummel had no answer. Did you talk to Oliver today? She probed. He hesitated and finally said, Yeah, sure. And you went to talk to him about our relationship? That got a reaction. No, that don't lie to me. He wilted a little and let out a frustrated sigh. Yeah, sure, we talked about it. We talked about other things too, though. Langstrot probed him with her eyes as if doing some kind of x ray scan. Her hands opened and began to wave in the air just slightly, and Brummel tried to sink out of sight into his chair. Hey, listen, he said shakily, it's no big deal. She began to speak as if reading off a note pinned on his chest. You're frightened. You feel cornered. You went to tell Oliver. You also feel controlled. She looked at his face. Controlled? By whom? I don't feel controlled. She laughed a little to put him at ease. Well, of course you do. I just read it. Brummel looked for a split second toward the telephone on the end table. Did Young call? She smiled with amusement. There was no need to. Oliver is very close to the universal mind. I'm beginning to meld with his thoughts now. Her expression hardened. Alf, I really wish you were doing as well. Brummel sighed again, hid his face behind his hands, and finally blurted, Hey, listen, I can't tackle everything at once. There's just too much to learn. She put her hands on his comfortably. Well, then, let's deal with these things one at a time, Alf. He looked up at her. You're frightened, aren't you? What are you frightened of? You tell me. And it was almost a dare. I'm giving you a chance to speak first. Well, then I'm not frightened. At least not until this very second, when Langstrat's eyes narrowed and began to bore into him. You are indeed frightened, she said sternly. You're frightened because we were photographed the other night by that reporter from the Clarion. Isn't that right? Brummel pointed his finger at her angrily. See now, that's exactly one of the things Young and I talked about. He called you. He had to have called you. She nodded, unabashed. Yes, of course he called me. He withholds nothing from me. None of us withholds truth from all the others. You know that. Brummel knew he might as well open up. I'm concerned about the plan. We're getting too big to hide anymore. We're risking exposure in too many places, and I think we were careless to meet out in public like that. But it's all been taken care of. There's nothing to worry about. Oh, no? Hogan's on our scent. I suppose you know he was asking Oliver some very delicate questions. Oliver can handle himself. So how do we handle Hogan? The same way we handle anyone else. Are you aware that he talked to Oliver about problems he's having with his daughter? You should find that interesting. What kind of problems? She's run away from home, and yet she still had the desire to be in my class today. I like the sound of that. So how do we use it? She smiled her cunning smile. All in good time, Alf. We can't rush things. Brummel got up and began to pace. With Hogan, I'm not so sure. He may not be the pushover that Harmel was. Maybe having Kruger arrested was the wrong thing to do. But you got access to the film. You had it destroyed. He turned to face her. And what did that get us? Before that, they weren't asking any questions, and now they are. Come on. I know what I'd think if I got my camera back and the film was ruined. Hogan and Kruger just aren't that gullible. Langstrat spoke soothingly, putting her arms around him like the tendrils of a vine. Ah, but they are vulnerable. First to you, and ultimately to me. Just like everybody, he muttered. He should have expected her reaction. She grew very cold and frightening and looked right into his eyes. And that, she said, is another topic you discussed with Oliver today. He tells you everything. The masters would tell me if he didn't. Brummel tried to turn his eyes away from her. He couldn't stand whatever it was that made such beauty so immensely hideous. Look at me, she insisted, and Brummel obeyed. If you're not happy with our relationship, I can always have it terminated. He looked down and stuttered a bit. It's okay. It's okay. What? I'm happy with our relationship. Truly happy? He felt desperate to appease her, to get to let go of him. I just don't want things to get out of control. She gave him a slow, vampirish kiss. You are the one who needs more control. Haven't I always taught you that? She was cutting him to pieces and she knew it, but she had him. He belonged to her. He still had a concern he couldn't shake. But how many adversaries can we continue to remove? It seems like every time we get rid of one, bingo, another pops up in his place. Harmel went out, in came Hogan. She completed the thought for him. You took care of Farrell. And in came Henry Bush. It can't go on. The odds are against us. Bush is as good as gone. Isn't there a confidence vote this Friday? The congregation is getting good and upset, but yes. You know he removed Lou Stanley from the church for adultery. Ah, yes. That should help the congregation decide. A lot of them agreed with that move. She backed away in order to gaze at him better, freezing his blood with her eyes. Are you afraid of Henry Bush? Listen, he still has a lot of support in the church, more than I thought he did. You are afraid of him. Somebody's on his side. I don't know who. And what if he finds out about the plan? He will never find out anything. If she had fangs, they would have been showing. He will be destroyed as a minister long before then. You will see to that, won't you? I'm working on it. Do not bow to this Henry Bush. He bows to you and you bow to me. I'm working on it, he said. She relaxed and smiled. Next Tuesday then. Huh? We'll celebrate Bush's Friday demise. You can tell me all about it. What about Hogan? Hogan is a limp, weakened fool. Don't worry about him. He's not your responsibility. Before Brummel knew it, he was standing outside her back door. Langstrad watched him through her window until he drove off, taking the usual alley route where he would not be seen. She opened the drapes to let some light in, extinguished the candle on the coffee table, and then took a folder from her desk drawer. Soon she had arranged it in neat piles, the life histories, personality profiles, and current photographs of Marshall, Kate, and Sandy Hogan. When her eyes fell on the photograph of Sandy, they glinted maliciously. Hovering invisibly over Langstrad's shoulder was a huge black hand, adorned with jeweled rings and bracelets of gold. A deep and seductive voice spoke thoughts into her mind. Tuesday afternoon at the Clarion resembled a battlefield after everyone is either dead or retreated. The place was deathly quiet. George, the typesetter, usually took the day after publishing off to recover from the wild deadline race. Tom, the paste-up man, was out covering a local story. As for Eddie, the secretary reporter ad girl, she had resigned and walked off the job last night. Marshall had not known that she once was happily married, but gradually became unhappily married and finally got a little thing going with a trucker that resulted in a very recent blow-up at home, with pieces of marriage flying everywhere and spouses fleeing abruptly in opposite directions. Now she was gone, and Marshall could feel the sudden void. Bernice and he sat alone in the glass-enclosed office at the back of the little newsroom ad up front office. From his second-hand $10 desk, Marshall could look through the glass and survey the 3 desks, 2 typewriters, 2 wastebaskets, 2 telephones, and 1 coffee maker. Everything looked cluttered and busy, with papers and copy lying everywhere, but absolutely nothing was happening. I don't suppose you know where everything is, asked Bernice. Bernice was sitting up on the work table adjacent to Marshall's desk, her back against the wall, stirring a personalized mug of hot chocolate. Well, we'll find it all, she answered. I know where she kept the books, and I'm sure her Rolodex has all the addresses and phone numbers. What about the cord to the coffee maker? Why do you think I'm drinking hot chocolate? Nuts. I wish somebody would have told me. I don't think anybody really knew. We'd better get an ad in for a new secretary this week. Eddie carried more than her weight around here. I guess it was a bad blow up. She's leaving town for good before her husband's black eyes heal up and he can see to find her. Affairs. Nothing good ever comes of them. So have you heard the latest about Alf Brummel? Marshall looked up. She perched on the work table like some coy bird, trying to look more interested in her hot chocolate than the spicy news. Under the circumstances, he said, I'm dying to hear it. Well, I had lunch with Sarah, his secretary, today. Guess he's gone for several hours every Tuesday afternoon and never says where, but Sarah knows. Guess our friend Alf has a special girlfriend. Yeah, Julene Langstrot, psychology professor out at the college. That ruined it for Bernice. How did you know? The blonde woman you saw that night, remember? The day after one of my reporters get busted for taking the wrong pictures at the carnival, Langstrot kicks me out of her class. Add to that Oliver Young's ears getting all red when he told me he didn't know her. You're brilliant, Hogan. Just a good guesser. She and Brummel do have something going. He calls it therapy, but I think he enjoys it, if you get my drift. So, what's Young's connection to either of them? Bernice didn't hear his question. Too bad Brummel isn't already married. I could have done more with it. Hey, reset your frequency, will you? We've got a little club here, and all three of these people are members. Sorry. What we're really after is whatever it is they don't want us to know, especially if, and I mean if, it's worth trumping up a false arrest to cover up and destroying my film. I wonder if any of those fingerprints on the film would tell us something. Not much. They're not on file. Marshall twisted in his chair to face her directly. All right. Who do you know? Bernice was smug. I have an uncle who's very close to Justin Parker's office. The county prosecutor? Sure. He does just about anything for me. Hey, don't bring them into this. Not yet. Bernice raised her hands as if she were pointing a gun at her and assured him, not yet, not yet. But I'm not saying they won't come in handy. Don't think I haven't thought of that before. So tell me this, did Brummel ever apologize? After you bowed to him the way you did? Are you kidding? No official signed apology from him in his office? Is that what he told you? Marshall had to sneer. Both Brummel and Young told me all kinds of things, how they hardly knew each other, how they were never anywhere near the carnival. Boy, I just wish we had those pictures. Bernice was offended. Hey, you can believe me, Hogan. You really can. Marshall looked into space for a second or two, musing. Brummel and Langstrop. Therapy. I guess that makes sense now. Come on, let's get all these pieces out on the table. What pieces? Marshall thought. How do you lay out a vague feelings and strange experience vibes? He finally said, this Brummel and Langstrot, they're both into the same kind of thing, I can tell. What kind of thing? Marshall felt cornered. How about whammies? Bernice looked puzzled. Oh, come on, Kruger, don't make me have to explain it. She said, you'll have to explain that to me. Oh boy, here we go, Marshall thought. Well, now it's going to sound crazy, but when I talked to each of them, and you ought to try it sometime, each of them had this weird, goony-eyed thing they did, kind of like they were hypnotizing me or something. Bernice started to crack up. Yeah, go ahead and laugh. What are you saying, that they're all into some kind of Svengali trip? I don't know how to label it yet, but yeah, Brummel's not nearly as good at it as Langstrot. He smiles too much. Young might be into it too, but he uses words, lots of words. Bernice studied his face for just the slightest moment and then said, I think you need a good stiff drink. You want a hot chocolate too? Sure, get me one, please. Bernice returned with another personalized mug. Edie's full of hot chocolate. Hope it's strong enough, she said, and hopped back onto the table. So why do these three try to look unconnected, Marshall mused. And what about the other two unknowns, Pudgy and the ghost? You never seen them before? Never. They could have been out-of-towners, Marshall sighed. It's a dead end. Maybe not yet. Brummel does go to that little white church, Ashton Community. And I heard somebody just got kicked out of there for shacking up or something. Bernice, that's gossip. What would you say then to my talking to a friend on the Whitmore faculty who might be able to tell me something about this mysterious professor lady? Marshall looked doubtful. Please don't make any more problems for me. I have enough as it is. Sandy? Back to the really tough subjects. We haven't heard a thing yet, but we're still calling around, checking with relatives and friends. We're sure she'll come home sooner or later. Isn't she in Langstrot's class? Marshall answered with some bitterness. Yeah, she's been in several of Langstrot's classes. Then he paused. Don't you think we might be blurring the line between unbiased journalism and personal vengeance? Bernice shrugged. I'll only find what's really there, and it'll be news or it won't be. In the meantime, I thought perhaps you'd appreciate a little background. Marshall couldn't shake off the memory of his encounter with the fiery Julene Langstrot, and he hurt more deeply every time he recalled the professor's ideas coming at him through the mouth of his own daughter. If it's a stone, turn it over, he finally said. On my time of the Clarions, just turn it over, he said, and started pounding his typewriter. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you for joining me for our week 2 of our reading This Present Darkness. Next week, next Monday, 5 o'clock, we'll pick it up right where we are with the next 4 chapters. Please do invite others. I thank you for coming. Father God, we love you and we thank you for this time. We thank you for those, God, that are dialing in, that calling in to listen. Lord, we thank you for those that listen on their own time. God, we believe that you're in control of all things. And as we have opportunity to rest and have varied forms of entertainment, I ask that you use this writing, God, to prompt in us how you want us to pray, how you want us to think of spiritual warfare. And God, I'm asking you to bless every home, provide provision, God, but help us draw in closer to you. We ask all in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right, you all have a wonderful week, and we'll see you again soon. Thank you for watching. Bye-bye.